Following along in Bob and Sandra's book, Sir, We Would See Jesus, the page references are there as well for the pages that we'll be covering each time. If you did notice on the schedule, and probably several of you did, I think I might have even mentioned it Wednesday night, that this lesson and the next one are a bit of a break from the track we've been on and delving into the life of Christ in great detail in the Gospels. We're going to take a step back and overview a couple of big piles of information from a distance that help us, I think, to understand what's going on in these accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the first lesson then in this quarter, the one we're doing today, is geography of the Bible lands, particularly in the time of Christ. So I'll spend this morning talking broadly about the geography of the land. I think it will help in understanding what's going on. The best thing you could do to help you understand Bible geography, though, is to go visit the land and spend some time over there. I think we've got some here that have done that. Trent spent I think, several months at least over there, and several have toured at a time or two. It's very, very valuable just to understand where things are in relation to one another and how the climate is and all of that. So, but we don't have that this morning. We can't trip over there right now, but we're going to try to do that somewhat virtually and give us some information that's valuable to us. So we are in the periods of retirement is what we're starting. And as I mentioned, I think Wednesday night, this is a section in the life of Christ where he's been busy, mainly around Galilee, but some in Jerusalem, but seems like he's preaching, teaching, working miracles all the time, great crowds around him, and yet he comes into a period of his life where he gets away from the crowds more, goes to different places, spends quality time with his disciples, and that becomes a critical point from here on until the time of his resurrection, as he's preparing them to take the gospel to the world. So that's what we mean by periods of retirement. He's not quitting, but he is a different approach, I think, to his work in the last year before his crucifixion. So we're studying geography today, and I borrowed some material from a geography lesson we studied a year and a half ago or so when we were back in the Old Testament getting ready for Israel to enter the Promised Land. So I borrowed some of that material, and you'll see some other material here. But I think just understanding what geography is more than just the lay of the land and the topography. It also includes climate, but it especially is lay of land, topography, lakes, rivers, mountains, cities, and all of that, in relation to how they interact with the people who are dwelling there at a given time. So the aspect of people really makes geography what it is. It's just, the lay of the land or topography if you don't have people. So this definition, which I thought was quite good from National Geographic, they ought to know what geography means. Geography is the study of places and their relationship between people and their environments. Geographies explore both the physical properties of Earth's surface and the human societies that spread across it. And so the interaction between those things is what geography is. So, as I was preparing this lesson, from the Old Testament period, 1300, 1400, or whatever, that the children of Israel are about to enter Canaan land, the Promised Land, until the time of Christ, don't let this blow your mind, the geography of what we call Palestine changed because the people changed. Because you've had people move in and out. We studied a lot of that change when we studied the years of silence, the things that went on there a couple of quarters ago. And as we open up the New Testament, that change has taken effect. And so the geography then becomes different. Canaan is the earliest name applied to the land. It's used frequently throughout the Old Testament. The Promised Land is a name given to it as God promised this land to Abraham and his descendants and gave the borders and boundaries of that promise. It's called the land of Israel because Abraham's descendants inherited the land. Abraham's grandson, Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. From him came the 12 tribes that inhabited the land. It is often referred to as Palestine today. The name came to be used, however, after Bible days. It's not a Bible term, and it is frankly not popular among Jews in Israel today. When we talk about a Palestinian state or the Palestinian people, they even question what that is from a historical standpoint. So it's not a popular term for some Israelis today. But Judea is the name of the Roman province. We understand the Romans now have conquered this land, and Judea is under Roman occupation. The kings that rule in Judea are there by the leave of the Romans. There are also Roman governors that are over the land. And so that has changed the geography of the situation quite a bit. So Palestine under Roman occupation in Jesus' day looked kind of like this. You have the broad area that might be called Judea, but you have Idumea, Judea, Samaria, Perea is on the other side, Decapolis, which has been mentioned several times, Galilee. And this map shows the Herod the Great's area, which is all of this, and then his descendants broke this up into 4 parts basically and ruled at different times in different places. And we studied all of that earlier. So I want to break this up into 2 sections and look at both sections a little bit more closely. Just open that up. So the top half, we've been a lot in the top half, okay, in the quarter we just finished. We've been in Capernaum a lot on the Sea of Galilee. This match mentions Jesus chose this small fishing town sort of as the hub of his public ministry for a year and a half, and I think we have seen that that's the case. He'll be back there again in the periods of retirement. We've talked about the Decapolis, the 10 Greek cities, Greco-Roman cities that were there to spread Gentile culture, basically. And here is Cana, Nazareth, Nain, Bethsaida, Gergesa. All of these places Jesus has visited in the quarter that we just studied. So we've been basically all over that map in the quarter that we just studied. The bottom half will be more in the bottom half this quarter, not exclusively, but more, and then almost this quarter. But here you have familiar towns, Jericho, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, which doesn't come into this section as much, but certainly town might. So these maps are probably really familiar to you, and you probably have a general understanding at least of the cities and towns and mountains and rivers and so on and so forth, the places where Jesus would have gone. When you think about Judea, it's not a very big place. Palestine of today, Israel of today. It covers about 12,000 square miles. That sounds like a lot, but Alabama is 51,000 square miles. So if we took all of this and put it in Alabama, it would look like that. It would only cover about the 16 northern counties. So it's not a big place in terms of square miles. That gives you the scale of it when we talk about Jesus traveling from place to place. It's a tiny country. From Dan to Beersheba is 150 miles. This was the ancient way of describing the length of the land, Dan at the very top to Beersheba at the south. From the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan Valley, if you're up in the middle of that, dissecting it, it's about 30 miles. If you go down to Gaza here, which is in the news a lot, but if you go down all the way to here, it's about 50 miles over the Dead Sea. So the angle of that causes it to increase. So the term Canaan is only applied to the west side of the river now and in ancient times as well. So typically this would be Canaan, the west side here. When you think about traveling then, and Jesus will do a lot of it, has done a lot of it, but it's been mainly around the Sea of Galilee. He'll travel more widely now. Of course, as a boy, he traveled all the way down to Egypt. But a 3-hour drive, say if you're going to drive from Dan to Beersheba, about 150 miles, right? there are roads in Israel that you could easily do that on today. That's even as we can go 100 miles in about 3 hours here. In Bible times, however, you take a chariot that distance, it's going to take you at least 5 days, and if you walk it, it'll be 10 days of really dedicated walking, and probably you won't make it in 10 days. So travel was not difficult in the days of Jesus. There were Roman roads, there were ways of traveling, but it was slow, much slower than we would imagine today. When you think about the climate of the land, Caesarea Maritima, which is on the seacoast, average temperature is about 71 degrees. Jerusalem, which is in the hill country, averages about 63 degrees. There are still palm trees and things that grow there. Jericho, which has lots of palm trees, is down in the valley. It's only 15 miles east of Jerusalem, but gets up to 110 there in the summertime. So the climate varies greatly depending on elevation in Palestine and the land of Israel. So you've got to pay attention to elevation to understand the climate. And to add to that then, Mount Hermon, which is to the north end of Israel, 9,200 feet high, is snow-covered probably year-round. It's cold up there all the time, as it is in the mountains of the United States. So, but you have that level of change in altitude from place to place, and that makes a big difference in climate. So I want to look at the distinct parallel zones, and this is something that we covered a quarter and a half ago, but I'll try to go quickly through this, and you can understand you've got the Mediterranean Sea, which is its own thing, and then you have a coastal plain here along the coast. That's the first of the 4 zones we'll look at. Here you have the hill country, the Shephelah, that runs up through here. The Jordan Valley, obviously, where the Jordan River flows, the valley that surrounds it, and then the tableland, which does not come into the story very much of Jesus. So when we just think about the Mediterranean Sea and how it interacts with the coastline, you've got a number of towns come into the story more prominently in the Old Testament, Tyre and Sidon specifically, but they'll be mentioned in Jesus' ministry in this quarter. You have Mount Carmel, obviously, that comes into the story. You have Caesarea, which comes into the New Testament story, but I don't think in this quarter. Paul will be imprisoned there, and we'll look at that much later on. But Herod the Great enlarged Caesarea and named it, of course, after Caesar. So as you go along the coast of the Mediterranean, it's a beautiful coastline. There are towns to visit like Joppa and Tyre. This is Tyre, jutting out into the sea. You might remember famously when we talked about Alexander the Great and his conquest, that used to be an island, and he was trying to conquer it, and so he destroyed the city back here and made a land bridge out to this island to conquer it. And the remnants of that is what Tyre is sitting on now. Most of that back there isn't city anymore, as according to Bible prophecy. But it's a beautiful area, all up and down it. This is the coast at Caesarea. This is where the governor's palace would have been right there. Paul would virtually have stood right there as he was being tried by Felix and Festus. That would be where that would have been. And as I'm taking this picture, there's an amphitheater, or theater, I should say, behind me, which probably is where Herod died when he was eaten by worms. So that comes into play. This is an aqueduct in the city. So that's the Mediterranean Sea and how it interacts a bit with the Bible story, although, as I said, most of that won't come into this quarter. When you look at the coastal plain, you have 3 divisions. The first is the plain of Phoenicia, the plain of or Akko, up here to the north, parallel to lower Galilee. Canaanites would have been there in ancient times. You have the plain of Sharon. We sing Jesus, Rose of Sharon, and that's the flowers that would grow on the plain of Sharon. And again, it's very fertile. Canaanites occupied it in ancient times. Then you have the plain of Philistia, where the Philistines would have been in ancient times. And I know it is in that area that I think Trent spent a good bit of his time when he was over there. In the hill country, there's quite a bit to talk about and quite a bit that relates to what will happen in this quarter and what happened in the past quarter. The hill country is west of the Jordan, and it saw many events in the life of Christ. So you have this large area, Judea, Samaria, part of the hill country. You also have a part up here, the Lebanon mountain range nearest the sea is called Lebanon. Some of those mountains are 10,000 feet above sea level, and then the anti-Lebanons are across from there. Most of that doesn't come into the Bible story, although Jesus, in going to a high mountain to be transfigured, may have been one of those mountains. Very possibly could have been, or something like that. We're not exactly sure. Looking at the hill country, the Leontis River runs between Lebanon and the hills of Galilee to the north. And the Leontis River is right there. It forms quite a barrier between and Lebanon. Even today, there's like a 2,000-foot gorge that goes down there, so it's a physical barrier. And then you have Galilee, and Galilee's where Jesus has been. It's this 50-mile section of land, a lot of hills there. You have Upper Galilee, the hills are more rugged, 2,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. Lower Galilee, they tend to ease off a little bit, but still somewhat mountainous by our standards as you go into Lower Galilee. So all of this region is where Jesus has been to the west of the Sea of Galilee, particularly. And it's about a 50-mile section, as the text indicates. Some of the things that we'll see, we're about to see him in Philippi, which is to the north of this area, up toward Dan. You see the mountains getting a little bigger here. Caesarea Philippi itself would have been along where this rock face is. There are a number of archaeological remnants of the city and the idol worship that went on there, and we'll look at that more closely as we go along. So this is that area. Jesus will spend some time there. This is where he asked his, "Who do men say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" And Jesus and Peter makes the confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So that's where that occurs. We've been all around the Sea of Galilee. We've been on the sea with Jesus. We've looked at Mount Arbel. We've been on the coastline, and we'll continue to be there throughout the gospel accounts. And even after Jesus' resurrection, he was along this coastline with another miraculous catch of fish. This is sunrise on the Sea of Galilee. And we've been there with him this last quarter. We've been in the synagogue with him in Capernaum a number of times, and other synagogues around the Sea of Galilee. As we've talked about, this particular synagogue is built on the footprint of the one that Jesus would have walked in. It was built a couple 300 years later, but right on that same footprint of the synagogue of Jesus' day. So you get a good idea of where Jesus lived, where he walked, even some of the structures that he might have walked in. We continue in the hill country and we go a little bit further south then. So we've been in Galilee and up north, so looked at Caesarea Philippi and some of these places around Galilee. And now, just south of there is the Jezreel Valley as we're coming down this wide open valley. Very, very fertile. It's really the breadbasket of Israel even today. Just a lot of crops. You can grow anything there practically. A lot of crops are grown there. You have the Kishon River, which flows west and into the Mediterranean Sea. That's a critical feature here. It kind of starts its headwaters kind of around Megiddo, and that's significant. And then you have the central hill country just below that. The highest peaks here, they're not like the mountains of Lebanon. They get up to 3,000 feet. You've got Gilboa and Ebal and Gerizim, important mountains, both in, especially the last two, in Old Testament and New Testament. I really like this. I don't know who did this. I ran across it some years ago. if you were flying, say 20,000 feet high, and you're flying over the Mediterranean Sea, east-southeast is the direction you're flying, and see over here the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River running down this Rift Valley to the Dead Sea, right across there. Here is Nazareth on this mountainside as you enter into the Jezreel Valley. So this is the Jezreel Valley I was talking about. This is Megiddo. A lot of Old Testament and New Testament Bible events occur here. This is Mount Carmel. And you get a pretty good idea of the topography of the land, I think, from that picture. Important places for us to be aware of. This is the Jezreel Valley. On one of my visits there, you can see obviously a lot of farming in that area. Those of you who are farmers appreciate that. What would have been this way in Jesus' day, although I'm sure the rows wouldn't have been as straight, but they no doubt farmed it. And you can see in the distance Mount Tabor, which is a prominent hill mountain, another site where Jesus may have had some of his activities when it would say he'd go up to a mountain. I'm not sure necessarily about that, but it certainly is a prominent place on the edge of the Jezreel Valley. We've already talked some about Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal because that's where, next to there, that Jesus had the discussion with the woman at the well in Samaria. This comes into the Bible story way back in the time of Abraham. Abraham visited here, and then you have Mount Gerizim, Mount Ebal, where the blessings and curses were read as the children of Israel were entering the land. You have Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman. So in the Old Testament, the town here would be called Shechem. In the New Testament, Sychar would be a village nearby. Nablus is the modern city that would be considered a West Bank or Palestinian city today. And going on further south, at least from the Jezreel Valley, on the southern end of the Jezreel Valley, you have the village of Nain that Jesus has already visited in our story. We looked at it a little bit on the hillside there and next to the Jezreel Valley. Again, that just gives you maybe a feel for it, of where Jesus is, where his movements are taking him. I think it helps you picture it in your mind if you can see some of this as you read the stories. Well, the hill country continues south as we go further down. We mentioned already. I mentioned that Galilee is about a 50-mile stretch of land. The hill country of Judea is also about a 50-mile stretch of land. And what separates them in Jesus' day is Samaria. So you have where the Samaritans are separating Judea, where you have a whole lot of Jews, and Galilee, where you have a whole lot of Jews, separated by the land of the Samaritans there. And that's crucial, of course, in the story that we've already told. The elevation drops somewhat, but still there are some notable hills and even what you might call small mountains along this way. Typically about 2,000 feet above sea level. Bethlehem is 3,800 feet above the Dead Sea, and that Dead Sea is only 14 miles away, so there's a vertical drop that's pretty prominent in that area. You go down from Bethlehem toward the Dead Sea or down from Jerusalem toward Jericho, and you can really tell that you're going downhill. It is steep incline much of the way. This is Jerusalem, as you would see it today, standing on the Mount of Olives. Most of you know this gold dome is a Muslim shrine. All of that area is controlled by the Muslims, but it is very nearly precisely where the temple would have stood in the days of Jesus. So it gives you a pretty good visual of where the temple might have been. This area around this flat plaza is called the Temple Mount. The temple would have definitely been in that area somewhere in the time of Jesus. Some of this has been put here in later times. That wall is a crucial wall, but there would have been a wall probably similar to in the time of Jesus. And this is the Kidron Valley that runs here. So you go down to the Kidron Valley today, there's a lot of olive trees, as there probably would have been in Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, there would have been a brook that ran through here. It's gone underground since Jesus' day. It doesn't run on top of the ground anymore. But that's where the brook Kidron would have been. It's called the Kidron Valley. The Temple Mount from this view is up to my right. And then turning around and taking a shot back at the Mount of Olives. This is the Mount of Olives as seen from the floor of the Kidron Valley. And there are still a lot of olive trees. You don't see necessarily in that picture, but there are a lot of olive trees going up to the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane. All of that is are tombs and graves. Some of them in this area quite ancient. You can think about the tombs of the prophets that might have been there in Jesus' day. There may be some of those that go back that far. I don't think quite, but anyway, that's a huge burial area now. Going south, and that doesn't come much into the study this quarter or next of Jesus' activities, but going south from there, you go to the ancient Negeb, which means south of Jerusalem and the south end of the land of Israel. And that forms a barrier between Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. So I want to talk a little bit about the Jordan Valley then, the river valley on each side of the Jordan River. That's the third zone. It's part of a great rift valley. Geographical feature, a rift is a crack in the earth's crust and typically runs along two fault lines. This particular rift valley begins on the northeast shores of the Mediterranean up north of Galilee and extends down the Jordan, through Palestine, Arabah, Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, and into Africa. It's a ginormous rift valley, and it's really, really impressive, the depth that the crack is. So as you look at the Jordan River, the Rift Valley is way bigger than where the Jordan Valley is. The Rift Valley is about 4,000 miles long. The portion from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea is called El Gor now, today. And it ranges, the valley does, from, say, 2 to 15 miles wide. It's virtually a tropical area as far as the climate goes because of its extremely low elevation. So lots of palm trees and all of that can grow along that. And it's fairly lush as long as you have enough water. So here's how that looks kind of in a relief map. Sea of Galilee down to, you see how the depth of it, I think, is what you see just flows down through that rift. The Jordan River itself has its headwaters at the foot of Mount Hermon, which we've already mentioned, mountain over 9,000 feet high to the north. The waters flow from there into Lake Hula when the Israelites inhabited. There's not much to Lake Hula anymore. After exiting there, it travels about 11 miles to the Sea of Galilee. It drops 900 feet in elevation as it travels that distance. This is a freshwater spring I was able to take a picture of up around Dan, and it's one of the little tributary springs that feeds the Jordan at this area to the north. That's a very pretty spring just coming out of the ground there. So when the river enters the Sea of Galilee, it's hard to get my head around this. But when the Jordan River enters the Sea of Galilee, it's 696 feet below sea level. That's how deep the rift is there. So it's a steep canyon going through this deep valley. The Sea of Galilee is the lowest freshwater lake on earth. It's about 12.5 miles long and 7.5 miles wide. It's called Chinnereth, or the Hebrews would probably say Kinnereth. I think I'm correct about that, something like that. Galilee, Tiberias, Lake of Gennesaret, those would be some of the labels for it and that are found in Scripture. As you continue to consider the Jordan River, it exits the Sea of Galilee, travels 65 miles to the Dead Sea, and descends another 600 feet in elevation. So you're going down, down, down. So the Dead Sea, as I think most of you realize, is the lowest point you can be on land and still be on land, on Earth. The waters underneath the Dead Sea can go down possibly another 1,300 feet. So it's a deep, deep rift where the Dead Sea is. The Dead Sea is 48 miles long, 10 miles wide at the widest point. So again, not a huge place, but it's significant. There are millions of tons of water that flow into the Dead Sea every day from the Jordan, the Arnon, Zered rivers that you've studied in times past, all feeding the Dead Sea. Nothing flows out. So the thing about evaporation, which you probably learned in grade school, is that water evaporates, salt doesn't, minerals don't. So the water evaporates, it leaves minerals. They don't have anywhere to go. So they've been building up there since at least the time of the flood, right? Building up and building up. And so the salinity of the Dead Sea is something. It's around 31%. So it's almost as much salt as it is water, 1% salt. So when you try to swim in it, as a couple of my companions did on our trip, and some of you may have done it as well, I know some have been there, this is what happens. You float. You can't sink. You're just being, I don't know how deep the water is there, but it doesn't matter. You're not going to sink all the way through it because you're sitting on salt. You're sitting on tons of salt, and you can't go anywhere. There are some things that live there, but not much as far as what's in the water. This is a picture of it. Pretty hazy when I visited there, but these are some sort of salt pools on the western side. This picture is taken, I think, not far from Masada. So Masada would maybe be at my back. And the length across here at this juncture probably is 6 or 7 miles. And the mountains that you're seeing over there would be the mountains of Moab from the Old Testament. It's the Jordan city, the country of Jordan now. Well, just maybe a little weather lesson. So when you have mountains, you have a sea and then you have mountains, the rain's going to drop on the water side of the mountains and the lee side's going to be dry. The mountains just sort of like squeezing out a sponge, going to squeeze all that moisture out of the clouds. As they go up over the mountains, they'll lose the moisture and you wind up on the dry side. So many of you know I grew up for many of my years growing up in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is on the dry side of the mountains. The mountains get sometimes, 10 feet of snow during the winter. Colorado Springs gets 6 inches because it's all dumped up in the mountains. And by the time the air gets to Colorado Springs, it's dry. It's very dry. And that's what happens a lot in the whole land of Palestine. You've got all that hill country, some high mountains, so on and so forth. And the way the winds and weather systems move as well, of course, causes the Dead Sea area to be very dry. And a lot of the area, kind of the hill country, can be somewhat arid as well once you get past the mountains. Just quickly, and we'll be done, and everybody that doesn't like geography can have a sigh of relief because we won't touch on this anymore. But you have 3 major trade routes that are worth knowing about. The Way of the Sea, the Via Maris, as it's called here, main road that goes up and down the coast. It would be a road that a lot of the armies would take in wars coming up and down through Israel. And you have the Way of Shur, which is along the hill country, goes through the Shephelah country. And then you have the King's Highway that's famous from the Old Testament. I think if we study the travels of Abraham, most of us have thought about the King's Highway. That's over here in the Transjordan Plateau here. These ancient trade routes, main trade routes, basically highways that are modern that we use that have 18-wheelers on them and that kind of stuff. There are other ways, certainly, of traveling north and south and east and west, and some of them are ancient. But these routes, I think, would have been traveled by Christ and his disciples, particularly the way of Shur, if they're traveling up through this section, which they did, we know. And they may, and probably as they go over into the Decapolis and Perea and the ministry that they do over there, you can imagine them traveling up and down the King's Highway as well. All right, that's about all I know of the geography of the land. Anybody have a question or a thought you'd like to throw into this before we quit? Anybody find that helpful at all? Interesting at all? Hopefully. Trent, did you have anything you'd like to add to it? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Super. I'm glad for him to point that out. So he's saying that basically in this illustration, Jerusalem's going to be about right here. Yeah, here's what you're saying? Okay. And then this is going to be Jericho? Okay. So Jerusalem about right here is getting a lot more moisture than Jericho. And this is only, what is that, 15 miles? I mean, that's the drop from here to here down to Jericho. But Jericho's, you're heading out into just complete parched, dry land. It's the last thing before that dry stretch, the plains of Jericho that the spies would have traversed, and so on and so forth. That's just flat dryness from Jericho to the river. Thank you. All right, we'll stop there, and next Sunday we'll have singing Wednesday night. Next Sunday we're going to talk about the purpose of miracles. So we'll be looking at a lot of Scripture. I know I didn't look at Scripture today. We'll be looking at a lot of Scripture next Sunday and thinking about why is Jesus performing all these miracles? What's that about? And then we'll go on looking at his life as it unfolds in the periods of retirement.